Hi, Commander Runningcloud here. Um, One of the things that I planned to do when I was getting my inheritance, I was kind of waiting to get my inheritance, and as you know, it never came through. But while I was waiting to get my inheritance, what I planned to do with it was to publish my book on Ivy League faculty plagiarism. So after I entered the Nine Dots Prize and thought I had no more alternatives after I lost that, and my brother Andre stole my inheritance, and I didn't win the Nine Dots Prize, where I actually talked about Ivy League faculty plagiarism. I was really giving up hope, right? And that's when I pretty much got contacted by the resistance. I'm going to call it the resistance, okay? And that's not the white hats. It's superior to the white hats. The white hats are Europeans fighting Europeans for the sake of Europeans. They don't even recognize us as a part of it. But the resistance is the good ETs, the interdimensionals, the eternals that have been living on Earth, and maybe even the elementals. I don't know. But they opened up new doorways for me, which included self-publishing, right? So I was able to self-publish Ivy League faculty plagiarism and reach a wider audience. I honestly thought that once Ivy League faculty plagiarism was published, that my whole life would change. I thought that the public would find out what was happening in the Ivy League, and I thought that they would just really be angry about it and just be a part of me. But what the powers that be decided to do was they decided to dilute my story and turn it into the college elite cheat scandal, where Felicity Huffman went to prison instead of Henry Louis Gates and Hazel Carby. They were not even included in the revelations. They didn't even talk about faculty stealing the work of graduate students. So I was really surprised that my book didn't lead to improvement in my situation there in Phoenix, Arizona. I was really surprised. And if you're wondering why did they bury my story in the college elite cheat scandal, and why did they bury my story and not tell the American people that there are plagiarism rings in the Ivy League that politically evaluate candidates, and if the candidates are not supportive of European nationalist racism, the candidate's work will be stolen and the candidate will be blacklisted and sent away. That's a very important story. But here's the thing. When you don't know you're under attack, you can be easily beaten. When your enemies are able to stay under the radar so you don't even know they exist, they can eat you alive before you even realize that they're in your body, in your political body. You can be eaten. So silencing me way back when, I'd already shown my propensity to defending the people at Northwestern University when I protested against a European student telling the black students in Allison Hall that we were too stupid to be there, that we were just there to fulfill a quota, and that all the European students knew it. Well, I was punished for that. And I didn't really realize it at the time. But then I wanted to be a corporate lawyer, and Sheldon L. Epstein sabotaged my career. So I couldn't be that either. So then I go into business, I find racism. Where I'm living, I find racism. When I lived at Outer Drive East, the woman that lived right next door to me was named Heidi. And Heidi was Swiss. And Heidi was so consumed with European nationalist racism that she was almost seething. Sometimes I'd meet her in the laundry room if I wasn't there fast enough to empty my clothes out one time. She really degraded me in a personal kind of a way. And there were other machines, but she really degraded me in a personal way that was kind of like, I shouldn't have to wait for you. I mean, she was very degrading. When I found out that she was the executive director for Zonta, Zonta, and then I looked up what Zonta was, that Zonta is an organization that works with African girls in Africa. And I knew that Heidi hated Black Americans. What do you think Heidi's organization Zonta was really doing in Africa? What do you think Jana Brazil, who sabotaged my career in her own way, was doing in Haiti after she decided to become an African Americanist? Why was she in Haiti? All over the place. Why is Douglas Rogers going into Indian country while he's working for Russian oil and gas? You see, if I had succeeded in publicizing my story, which I could have if I'd gotten my inheritance, then all of these other people in academia who are sabotaging the American economy and the American people, they would have all been found out. They would have all been found out. They would have all been exposed because I would have opened the can. So you can bet the European nationalist racists could see me coming. They had identified me, just like all of the kids who stood up against the Jews to protect the Arabs from genocide. They all got marked. I was just reading today where in Arizona, Americans were not allowed to go to the commencement because they dared to stand up against the Jews who were creating genocide. So we're not playing out here. But as long as we're believing the public lies that people have a right to genocide in other people, that people have a right to a manifest destiny over American lands, that people have a right to go to Africa and steal things for a space program that Africans are not a part of, that people can go to Africa and steal gold and diamonds and water and oil and precious minerals. As long as we have a public dialogue, a public discourse that says that's okay, that's all right, that's socially acceptable, then we're going to have these problems. And if I'd gotten my inheritance, it wouldn't be that way. Okay? I'm doing everything I do on a Hummy with no money. So when I found out that I could self-publish, I self-published my book, Ivy League Faculty Plagiarism, available on Amazon. And this book was epistolary. Epistolary means consists of correspondence. It consists of my correspondence to Hazel Carby and Henry Louis Gates and different people in Yale and Harvard about what had happened to me and what I knew about it at that time. Nobody negated the facts of my story. I published an ad in the Yale Daily News to try to advertise it. I didn't get one single sale. But if I'd gotten my inheritance, I would have put out a full page ad in the New York Times. I would have hired interviewers and story writers and all kinds of people to bring up the facts of my case, that foreigners and Uncle Tom Negroes stole my work and sabotaged my career. And then things would be very different for Americans today, wouldn't it? Douglas Rogers wouldn't have gone to the Mojave Desert this March to do some oil and gas exploration. My people wouldn't be under such a tense genocide. And everybody would know about things that I talk about now and here. Now, once again, let me remind you that I know that the Europeans that control cyberspace can control who gets to see me to a point. But I also know that there are people out here, time travelers, good ETs, interdimensional beings, and other sources. You're playing with my lights. You might turn the recording off. I'm going to watch it. And other sources that can actually come in and see what I have to say. So today I want to teach the people that do not know, the anthropologists, the intergalactic war strategists that do not understand everything. I want to talk about the supply chain. Europeans decided that everything in the world will belong to them, and they act upon it. And the rest of us didn't know. We didn't know that that was their intention. We thought that they were friendly and nice. We didn't know that they were coming to take our lives away so they could control our property. If we knew, we could have protected ourselves. If we knew, we could have created strategies. If we knew, we could have had an intervention, because there's so much fewer of them than there are of the rest of us. Cyberspace and social media has made it possible for all of us to be able to talk across the nations. But before that happened, I was studying comparative literature for my doctorate. And I was teaching and reading non-European fiction in the American language. That was what I taught. I figured that there are enough people promoting European culture, so I never, ever taught an European author. And it wasn't long before I saw that whether the author was a Chinese American or a Japanese American or a Native American Indian or an Indian American from Punjab or a Black American, all of the non-European Americans had pretty much the same opinion of the Europeans. And that was that the Europeans hated them, showed it, and denied them economic freedom and denied them personal dignity. And when you hear this from one culture after another, for me, it was a real epiphany, because we didn't have social media back then in the 90s. I'm finding this out by reading one novel after another, and I'm saying, well, I'll be damned. They did it to you too. Well, I'll be damned. You too? Wow. And I found out that all of the non-Europeans have one thing in common. The Europeans trying to kill you and steal your stuff. Now, Europe itself is very small and does not have many resources. If they were to mine the Alps and dig up all the Alps, maybe they could survive for a century on the assets produced by their own mountains. But they would change their topography so much, and they would deprive themselves of so much skiing and so much of their natural beauty. But they don't have any problems with doing that in Arizona or New York City or Connecticut. They don't have any problem in doing it in my lands or African lands or Hawaiian lands. They don't have any problem destroying our natural beauty for their own profit. And then they can go home again, right? So while Heidi sat in one of the most exclusive high-rise condominiums in Chicago during the 1970s and 80s, early 80s, while she sat there hating on me, she was getting her money by running a colonialist project called Zanta in Africa. Okay? If Europeans did not have a supply chain to undergird their constructed economy, they would only have the assets in Europe to do trade with. That would be all that they would have, is what they had in their own land and what they could sustain in their own land. What happened instead was the Europeans used their warrior tendencies, descended from the Norsemen, who used to rape and pillage everyone until they worked their way north to the German Huns and found very, vicious cavemen emerging among them. And they just sort of like a snowball accumulating. They just gathered more and more and more people from the small little area that Europe owns. And they spread out. If the European supply chain were stopped today, Europeans would not have a space program. Europeans would not have wealth. Europeans would not have the materials to make weapons. Europeans would have nothing if they couldn't steal it from America, where my people own everything. If they couldn't steal it from Africa, where the Black Africans own everything. If they couldn't steal it from Hawaii and Papua New Guinea and New Zealand and Fiji, where all the Polynesian people are. If they couldn't steal it from China, can they steal it from China? Can they steal it from Japan? Well, when they couldn't steal from Japan, they certainly destroyed it. Didn't Werner von Braun, Elon Musk, create that Hiroshima and Nagasaki to make sure that the Japanese innovation wouldn't get too far? And when the Japanese created the Toyota car, that was absolutely revolutionary. Everybody wanted a Toyota because Toyotas ran great on gas. Well, the American automobile industry should have gone under. That would have been fair competition. That would have been the laws of supply and demand. That would have been a pure form of economics. What'd they do instead? Well, they sued Japan. They said, you're dumping steel in our country. You're dumping cars. We can't beat your prices, so you got to get out of here. But the automotive industry was only benefiting the Europeans. And once they let off all the auto workers, it really benefited all the Europeans. And once they let unions take the place of individuals complaining, they really made it just for the Europeans. So when the Europeans used their laws to stop Japan from dominating the automotive market for creating a better machine, it was all based on racism. And you know what happened? The quality of cars went down instead of rising up to what the Japanese industrialists and manufacturers and engineers had created. Instead of everything moving up and rising, the Europeans made sure that they depressed the quality so that they could continue to conquer the earth with the oil and gas industry. So they could continue to murder my people in Oklahoma and steal our lands using their courts, because that was a better economy than an economy truly based on value. Well, if the Europeans are ever to be controlled so that the rest of us have a chance to live, we would have to be able to cut off their supply chain. We would have to be able to stop them from using their courts and using their law enforcement and using their military to kill us when we say, I'm sorry, that's mine. And they say, not anymore. Bladow, you're dead. And all your kin. If Europeans are forced to use the resources of Europe alone, and they're not allowed to steal from Africa, and they're not allowed to steal from America, then war will end, at least from the Europeans. Now, I don't know human nature for sure. Maybe once the Europeans are defeated, another vicious race will rise up. Maybe another race that wants to conquer the world will rise up. I don't know if that's going to happen. I really don't. I just know that the Europeans have succeeded in going to every island, every place, because they control transportation, they control oil and gas, they control the ports, they control the entire supply chain. And they've made the supply chain so convoluted that if you're not authorized, you can't find a place within the supply chain. You can't find a place within their system. But we have to admit that everything in America belongs to real Americans. If there is such a thing as private ownership, the Europeans don't own a thing here because my ancestors were here first. But their response to that is, well, if you're dead, you don't have a claim. If you're dead, you don't own anything. So guess what we're going to do? We're going to make you dead. We're going to kill you as a society, and then we're going to kill you as a woman. If Africa can get control of their natural resources, they can stop the space program tomorrow, because the Europeans are going to use the space program to go to war with the Africans. It won't matter how many African men and women are willing to go to fight if you've got a Starlink satellite that can just wipe everybody out overnight. And if you can do it without touching them or even leaving a trace that you were there, even better, because then the other people in the world can't say, hey, you can't do that. You can't do what you did over there, Europeans. So much depends on Africa. And Africa needs to be aware that all of their floods that are killing their people could very well be created by European agencies that control weather, like DARPA and HARP. They're creating bioweapons. They're creating space attacks. They're creating environmental threats through weather and contamination of water. They're doing a lot of things to kill a lot of Africans without laying their hands on one. But if every African port were closed, if every African mine were taken over by the African people, if every European business person in Africa were put under surveillance and suspended from doing business until things get straightened out, the whole world would experience an elevation. Now, here in America, just for reporting the crimes in Arizona, Tina Ainley and the other Europeans in the court and law enforcement in Arizona tried to kill me and throw me in jail. So in America, we've got a lot of people, but we're all beaten. We're beaten already. And the reason that you don't know that we were even victims of a war and genocide is because they wouldn't publish our stories. They wouldn't let us talk. They wouldn't publish our books. They put people like Hazel Carby and Henry Louis Gates and Brent Hayes Edwards and Valerie Smith as Americans in higher education that made sure they would block the truth coming out. So why they targeted me is because I was going to have the economic power to force the truth out. And I didn't get it, but I got cyberspace. And cyberspace alone wasn't enough. Cyberspace didn't protect me from getting captured by the Europeans and the Arizona state troopers and getting thrown into their jail with no charges and getting hauled and prosecuted in their superior court with no charges. And they wouldn't let me say a single thing to defend myself, and they wouldn't defend me because silencing me, destroying me, and killing me was their objective. So in America, they've stolen our inheritance. They've stolen our land, and they've installed a surveillance system of road gangs and law enforcement and spy houses. In certain places, you'll see a house in the woods, house off the highway, that's doing surveillance on all the traffic that comes down the road. Because the Europeans have totally militarized the United States of America. They've totally militarized this continent. They have spies everywhere where they can watch you. So if you think that you're going to get to go out and discover something or find yourself a lot of land where you want to grow crops or create a factory, the Europeans will prevent you because they save it for themselves. They'll come around later when they're ready and they'll say, oh, Elon Musk, you want this big lot of land? No, don't worry about the owners. They're all half dead, and the ones that aren't dead are under control. So we in America, we blacks and we black Indians and we red Indians and we white Indians, we are pretty much handcuffed by law enforcement, judges, and the European government. Look at the court in Arizona. Just go to the page and look at the court and see that every single one of them is an European. And every single one of them are bringing Americans into jail, fining Americans beyond what they can pay, stopping Americans and saying they're drunk. That's why I wouldn't roll my window down. I knew if I rolled my window down, they'd say they smelt drugs or liquor in my car, because that's what had happened to me when Diego Hernandez sent the Arizona State Troopers after me. They lied. They lied a lot. They lied a lot on the police reports. And I proved that they lied. But it didn't matter because it wasn't about justice. And you see, if I had gotten my inheritance, I would have had the money to broadcast it far and wide. And everyone would know exactly how far the enemy of Americans are willing to go to deprive us of our assets. In Australia, the landowners are also silenced and detained. I actually saw a brief report about a landowning family that can't get communications. They can't get into cyberspace. They can't tell their stories, and they're held somewhere remotely contained. Because when we see Europeans in Australia, we know that in order to settle Australia and take control of all that landmass, the Europeans sent every psychopath from England into that land. If you look at them, you can see them. They genetically, they look very different as a class of people from the people in Britain who were allowed to stay there. But Australian Europeans descended from prisoners. They emptied the prisons. You'll hear people say, oh, this migrant, this border problem, they're emptying their prisons. Well, the precedent for that was Great Britain sending the worst people into Australia, because they knew from the Oregon Trail and the Mormons that the best way to murder and genocide a people is to send your psychopaths out their way, because your psychopaths will sadistically murder the people and won't have a qualm about it. And then they'll have psychopath children that will continue the same way. Did you know that Tina Ainley's husband, Tina Ainley, the court judge that violated my human rights, who should be in a prison under a death sentence for how many Americans she's killed, including me, including the devastation she put into my life, her husband died in Austria, home of the Nazis. You see, they don't even try to pretend that their roots are not Nazis and Jews from Eastern Europe that call themselves Israelis. They don't even pretend that they're not trying to steal the land from the Americans and the Arabs. You see, they can't steal land from India because India has such a big population and an ancient culture. But in America, they were able to infiltrate in the East Coast, and we were innocent. We didn't know they were here to kill us and steal our land. And we didn't know that they would wait and infuse themselves in slowly and then let the genocide expand. We didn't know. We didn't know, because at each generation, each decade, they pretend that they got rid of the problem. Ivy League faculty plagiarism problems were not solved by a big media show about college elite cheats, but they substituted it that way. And when I was attacked and prosecuted, they made George Floyd. They had a George Floyd event. And George Floyd became the emblem that for everybody. But did any laws change? No. Europeans were still allowed to do what they did to me after George Floyd. So we don't see any change because we never really bring into the public atmosphere the conversations that need to be had about European nationalist racism. We never really talk about the supply chain and how the supply chain enables Europeans to control the economic system. And through controlling the economic system, they are able to create weapons of mass destruction. They're able to infiltrate other cultures, pretending they're tourists or visitors. But they're really anthropologists gathering data for the best ways to undermine the integrity of a culture. Chinua Achebe, a Nigerian author and statesman, actually wrote books about this way back in the 1970s. Arrow of God, Things Fall Apart. He actually wrote about how the Europeans come in and find the weakest links in the culture, the people that have been excluded, the people with access to grind, the people that are bitter, who have been left out, and they actually embrace them and give them economic wealth through the church and give them economic power so that people will come to them anyway. And then those people and their people undermine the culture. I don't know if Africa can really pull it off, but I know that we are beaten here in America. I know that much. I know that when I'm living in a concentration camp and Black Americans are deploying weapons, bioweapons created by the military upon me, and they're hacking into my computer system and hacking into my phone, and they're breaking into my room and they're terrorizing me. When I drive my car, they're sending road gangs out so that I'm driving on a somewhat abandoned street and suddenly I'm in a traffic jam, especially for me. All these things that have happened to me, if they're exposed, they can't happen anymore. Because I told you once already that once I was stalking on Memorial Drive, I was just observing all of the gang stalkers in cars on Memorial Drive. And this is before they started to do construction to install these great big underground pipes that are taller than people. And I was there parked one Halloween within the past, I've been living here 3 years, I guess. So within the past 3 years. And I saw a Chinese man come speeding up and speeding into the enclave where I was parked on the side. And he was surrounded by other cars, a car here, 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 a car here. Okay? So it looked like a traffic jam, and that was rushing by him, sort of goading him forward. And he just has to get off the road really quickly. And right after he got off the road, the traffic stopped and went back to normal. And I said, well, I'll be damned. I thought that only happened to me. But it didn't only happen to me. And when I was in Brownsville, the road gangs actually interfered with Lynn's Diner. Lynn's was a Chinese restaurant, buffet style, with the best food in the world. Oh my God, their fried fish was just like my grandmother made it. Oh God, I miss the food at Lynn's so much. And Lynn's was a perfect place for a senior citizen to get great nutrition, balanced diet. And they built a Highway 10, right through the middle of the business district. And to get to Lynn's, if you were right across the street, you'd have to drive half a mile up this way on parallel to 10, and there would be cars that would suddenly appear to accompany you there because you'd have to get over 3 lanes, and they make it hard for you to get over those 3 lanes by a sudden traffic jam. But once you got over that 3 lanes, you'd have to make a big old U-turn and come back around and go a half a mile again, with a sudden increase in traffic to accompany you once again. So if you're a senior citizen and your nerves, we don't want a lot of anxiety on the highway. We're mellow, 60 and mellow. We don't want to fight traffic. We don't want to feel like we're in a freaking traffic jam. And they would have this traffic pattern even if you went at 4 o'clock when the workers weren't out, when you wouldn't expect rush hour traffic. And it was deliberate. It was a deliberate move to take away the business from the Chinese American businesses. And when I went to downtown Brownsville, decimated, totally decimated. No place to shop, totally decimated. The Europeans had done so much damage to Brownsville because it was a port town. There's the Brownsville Port, which is a privately owned port. And they were shipping so many resources out of America on tanker cars, on the railroad, a railroad that somehow became private. They were shipping so much stuff out of Brownsville that it was ridiculous. And they had so many businesses that were not really businesses. They were smuggling and manufacturing depots. It was really horrible. But to me, the worst part of all was what they were doing to Lynn's. Lynn's had been there for years. All their staff was mostly Chinese living in America, Chinese Americans, here for probably centuries. But they were targeted by the Europeans and the cartels. And Brownsville was just a mess. In Boca Chica, where Elon Musk is, it wasn't very far away. And in Boca Chica, you could easily see that the Gulf of Mexico had been built out, that they built underground the Gulf of Mexico and made a faux beach. They made a phony beach because the water goes and then it just drops off. And while I was there, you could still go to the beach, but nobody was there. And Elon Musk, SpaceX, was given the right. The other Europeans in government and in the courts had given Boca Chica, Elon Musk, the right to close the beach whenever he wanted to, if he was going to launch something that was of no benefit to the rest of us. But guess what? If Africa can stop the Europeans from exporting their stuff, if they can get to those underground bunkers where the Europeans are sending things out on underground trains to the ports, if they can stop the traffic, the Europeans won't be able to launch anything into space because there isn't enough raw material in Europe for them to do that. They'd have to get it from here in America or in Australia or in some other place that belongs to some other people. Did you know that Eskimos used to live in Greenland and now it's Scandinavians? Scandinavians have claimed it. Europeans have given each other permission to put their flag and their name on any land they want to. And land they can't own, they want to pick a fight with those people. They want to pick a fight with China. Right? Now, Russia is a special case because Russia is European. That's a good cop, bad cop situation. Russia is a group of Europeans that stand to become wealthier than the inland Europeans. But Russia is so close to China and so close to India that you should never forget that the Russian government is European. And as long as the Russian government is European, they're European. And you can look at that movie, The King's Man, that came out just a couple of years ago, to see the European cousins deciding who would get Russia. It's part of Europe. So while you'll hear the Europeans saying we're mad at Russia, look at it the same way you look at the Germans and the Jews. They're only enemies in their own race. When they look at you, you're the enemy. When they look at you, they want your stuff. Now, I'm not exactly sure how China is moving out into Africa. I'm not sure if China is trying to be as imperialist and exploitative as the Europeans are. But somehow I doubt it, because China has so much land that they can develop for themselves. And China has so many assets that they can develop for themselves. And do you know, in the part of Russia that borders with China, there are a lot of Mongol people there. There are a lot of Chinese people actually living there. And you don't see them the same way you don't see us, the black and red Indians. They genocided my tribe, one of my tribes, my paternal side tribe, got genocided because we were East Coast. And the invasion of Europeans starts on the East Coast, closest to their lands. But my Oklahoma tribe is still alive, but they won't let us possess our stuff. And the Europeans have taken over the government. And here's the thing about it. If it was just one group of Europeans in one state, you could use a political system to defeat them, but it isn't. It's European nationalism. That means any place in the planet where the Europeans go, and off planet and intergalactic, they remain loyal to the supply chain that benefits the Europeans. The Europeans created a supply chain where people who own the land can't use the land to sustain themselves. The people that own the land are forced to depend upon the European supply chain for their sustenance. And the European supply chain is established to use the European controlled ports. So if I were a political advisor on defense strategy for the continent of Africa, one of the first things I would do is be to gain control of the ports and look for underground smuggling facilities that the Boring Company could facilitate, like we have at the Gulf of New Mexico, like we have built out on our eastern coast. And if you look at the map of the Caribbean and you wonder, hey, how come the water changes color? It's because the Europeans have built things underneath so that the people are not even aware of how much of their wealth is being robbed from them. But the Australians can't fight you, can't fight the Europeans. The Americans, the real Americans, can't fight the Europeans. They've got us two bound up. India can fight the Europeans. China can fight the Europeans. And Africa can fight the Europeans. And that's the only hope for my family. That's the only hope for my people. The only hope for my people is that India, China, and Africa, that is the BRICS nations, decide enough is enough. And once they make it impossible for the Europeans to deploy their space weapons on us, and once we are able to have the white hats move the corruption out and get fair elections, once we are able to advance to that point, my family could live, if there's anyone left of us. If there's anyone left in my family that's been so decimated by European nationalist racism. So in summary, European nationalist racism means that all Europeans that benefit from the economic system are engaged in war and theft and genocide. And none of them will speak up, and none of them will stand up against them. And when they fight, be it Russians against the other Europeans, or white hats against black hats, once again, the Hegelian dialectic of black equals evil and white equals good, that goes into white papers, white knights of Russia, St. Petersburg white knights. The sky's not white, bitches. White papers that give the technical data. You know, white, they put it on everything because it fits in with a linguistic system that constantly reinforces the idea that white is good and black is bad. And they created that to aid learning European nationalist racism. So the supply chain supports an economy that rewards the Europeans for genocidal behavior. And the supply chain depends upon invading other lands, other nations, genociding the landowners, which is the people that are there, the owners. Okay? The Europeans have decided, well, you don't own anything until you go through our legal process. But that's not the real law. That's the European nationalist law that says that if you can't get through our courts, you can't own a thing. And we're not going to let you through our courts. If the people that are living on the land, the people that depend upon that land for sustenance and recreation and commerce and even inspiration, those are the owners of the land. Okay? The people on the land are the owners of the land. The people whose families have been on the land generation after generation after generation after generation. Those are the landowners. Okay? So in America, we get a lot of Europeans who say, well, my family's been here since the 1700s. But if your family's been here as enemies of Americans, then you're not Americans and you're not landowners. You're successful warriors. You're people that murdered and robbed and victimized. And then said, I won my land. And that's immoral. It's immoral to kill people and then create a piece of paper that says you're entitled to their land. You're entitled to their stuff. And they just have to go off and die because they don't even have standing in your courts. So once you break the supply chain in Africa, and you stop the Europeans from exporting raw materials from Africa, you put a huge dent in Europeans' ability to conquer the rest of us. Weather modification is creating the climate crisis. And when Africans get access to the patent database and begin to study all that stuff about patents, they can really begin to understand exactly the weapons that they're being threatened by. When African nations can hack into Harvard University, Charles Lieber Institute databases, MIT databases, if Africa can get the best computer hackers to hack into the European databases and get all of the primary information, then Africans can develop weapons if they want. But I hope they don't want to do that. I hope they want to develop better forms of transportation, ways to desalinate water, ways to create efficient sewage situations, better plumbing. I hope that the Africans use the raw assets of Africa to improve the quality of living for all of us and not to make weapons like the Europeans did. They had free will. And they decided to use their free will to murder and rob the rest of us. And when I tell them, none of them say, you know what, you're right, despite the proof of it. None of them say, you're right, we're wrong, we're going to fix it. And until the Europeans take responsibility, we have to protect ourselves. The Australians are not going to be able to stop the psychopaths' heirs in Australia that have taken over their coastline and their best places to live. The Americans, my people here, we can't get the Carolinas back. My family can't get the Carolinas back. I can't get Oklahoma back. And the Indians in Arizona are being defeated by Tina Ainley and the other European justices, court judges, and law enforcement, and the people of Scottsdale and Wickenburg and Cave Creek. They're using witchcraft in addition to initiatory force against the Indians. And they just stole the water from the Indians and said, what you gonna do about it, bitches? What you gonna do? Nothing, because we've got you. So there's nothing we can do. We Americans, we are pretty much beaten. And all the Europeans, they stand together. They don't break ranks. They stand together as a unit. But Africa has enough people to do surveillance on the Europeans. Africans have enough political power amongst themselves to have the best representatives that will do the most for the people take power there. And most importantly, Africa has understood post-colonialism and how much they've lost and how much Europeans have come in and created fights amongst them so they could divide the African people. And the African people are working for unity. They might have killed Gaddafi, those nasty Europeans, but they didn't kill what Gaddafi stood for, which is the unification and protection of Africa and an Africa first mentality. So let me end this with saying that the supply chain is a chain that imprisons all the people by making us all dependent on Europeans for the stuff we need to live. And in order to create the supply chain, Europeans have corrupted commerce, economics as a science, law enforcement, the judiciary, government and politics, and human rights. They have authorized the deployment of biological weapons on the public of all races because they even want the Europeans' stuff now. Now that they've got us, my people, the real Americans, defeated and dying. It's so funny because they always think they have us dying, but somehow we just pop up and live again, we American Indians, which includes Black people. You need to know, when I say American people, I include the Blacks and maybe the Black Americans and South Americans came from Africa, but that would be a very long time ago. And if you look at some anthropologists that study the origins of the people, everybody came from Africa once upon a time. But the people that are African looking in the Americas have been American for millennia. They've lived in America for millennia, the Black people. We weren't brought here by the Europeans. We were already here. Because look at a map. It's not a long boat ride. And it's not like the Phoenicians didn't build wonderful ships that would actually take them to America. It wasn't like the Phoenicians didn't know how to live on their boats and eat fish from the ocean. They probably even had ways to desalinate water so that they wouldn't have to drink contaminated water. But when you've got an enemy that wants to claim all the land on the planet, and that enemy has decided that rather than create clean water and healthy food and good places for recreation, rather than make room for nature and let the tigers and the elephants and the hyenas even, and the kangaroo, let them live. But Europeans don't want anything to live except themselves. And that's a very serious problem. And the longer we don't look at it, the more of us will die. So despite the fact that I didn't get my inheritance, which it would have given me the economic power a lot sooner to blow the lid off of all of this and still be protected, I'm doing it in the time that's designated for it to be done. It wasn't my time. It's the time that God picked. The time when everything would be aligned for victory. Because God doesn't want my people to die. God doesn't want the American Indians to be extinct. God doesn't want Africans to grow up in slavery. God does not want the world that the European nationalists have envisioned and created for us. God doesn't want it. Do you know how good it feels to say that and know it's true? Do you know how good it feels to say God loves us and that God has lined everything up perfectly for me and you? You know, just imagining myself sitting 20 years older with my new family, my grandchildren, makes me really happy. But if we don't hurry up, my kids are millennials, you know? And while I might be hoping and believe in some magical world that reproduction life can be extended, like it was in biblical days when Sarah had babies. And maybe it's possible, you know, maybe it's possible. Maybe it is. So that I will have these grandchildren that won't be killed, that won't be snuffed out, that won't be put under so much economic constraint that they can barely see, like what happened to me, like what happened to us. So my hope for the future, if this planet continues to exist, my hope for the future, my rising sun, is in Africa. Yep, Africa is the ticket. The Africans are the ones. The Africans are the ones most likely to succeed in breaking the European supply chain. Thank you for joining me.